The sound came first. A high, piercing shriek that sliced through the suffocating opulence of the Magnolia Room. It was a sound of pure, unvarnished distress, so raw it made the crystal chandeliers tremble. Silverware paused halfway to mouths. The low hum of brokered deals and polite society chatter snagged. Then died completely. 100 pairs of the city's most discerning eyes turned toward the source of the disruption. Alara Vance didn't turn. She was already in motion. Working under the assumed name, Lena Petrova. She moved with an unsettling grace, her spine straight, her steps measured as she collected an empty champagne flute from a table of banking executives. Her uniform, a simple black dress. Crisp and severe was a costume, a shield of invisibility she had worn for 6 painstaking months. To the patrons of Atlanta's most exclusive restaurant, she was just another part of the scenery. A ghost meant to fill glasses and clear plates without leaving a trace of her presence. But tonight, the scenery was bleeding into the main event. At the center of the room, Richard Whitmore, the billionaire CEO of Whitmore Technologies, was crumbling. His face, usually a mask of corporate steel, was ashen. His hands trembled as he tried to soothe his son, 9-year-old Ethan, whose small body was rigid with sensory overload. The boy's cries were not tantrums. They were alarms, signaling a system failure in a world that was too loud, too bright, too much. "Is that the Whitmore boy?" A woman draped in diamonds whispered, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "You'd think he could afford a proper nanny." "Money can't buy decorum," her companion sneered back, taking a delicate sip of wine. Alara's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible flicker of the fury coiling in her gut. She had spent 5 years meticulously planning her return to this world, a world that had chewed up her family and spat them out, leaving nothing but wreckage and a name erased from history. She had studied its codes, its hierarchies, its cruelties. She knew that in rooms like this, compassion was a foreign currency, and a child's pain was merely an inconvenience, a stain on the perfect white tablecloth. Then, a new voice, smoother and more venomous than the others, cut through the air. Julian Thorne. He stood near the grand entrance, a titan of industry whose shadow fell long and dark over the city. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than her car. His silver hair swept back from a face that was handsome in a predatory way. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but his voice was pitched for performance. "Some pedigrees, it seems, simply cannot be refined," he said. A casual observation laced with arsenic. His gaze swept over Richard and Ethan, a flicker of something ugly, not just disdain, but satisfaction in his eyes. Richard flinched, as if struck. The insult was a public execution, delivered by the one man whose approval could make or break fortunes in this city. Thorne's gaze continued its slow, deliberate sweep of the room before it landed on Alara. For a split second, recognition sparked in his eyes, a confused, pained flicker, like a man trying to place a ghost. It was the moment she had been waiting for, the first crack in his fortress of arrogance. He didn't know her, not this version of her, but some deep, buried memory was stirring. He quickly masked it with a dismissive smirk. He approached her table, his presence sucking the air from around him. He didn't look at her directly, instead addressing the man whose glass she was refilling. But his words were aimed at her, each one a polished stone meant to bruise. "It must be so refreshing for you," Thorne said, his voice a low purr of condescension as his eyes finally met hers. "Working in an environment where precision is so valued, a new experience, I imagine." The insult was surgical, deeply personal, and layered with a history only the two of them could understand. Precision, The very word her father, David Vance, had lived by. The word thorn had twisted into a weapon to destroy him. The other guests wouldn't get it. They would only see a powerful man making a casual, classist jab at a waitress. But Alara heard the echo of a conversation from a lifetime ago, from the night her world ended. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of icy calm. This was the first test. 5 years of planning, of suppressing a grief so vast it threatened to drown her. All came down to this moment. She could shatter, or she could become the weapon she had forged herself to be. She finished pouring the water, the stream not wavering by a single millimeter. She placed the pitcher back on her tray with a soft, deliberate click. Then, she looked directly into Julian Thorne's cold, gray eyes. "Precision is a habit, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice even and clear, carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear, not a privilege. A stunned silence fell over the surrounding tables. Thorne's smile tightened at the edges. He had expected fear, or deference, or invisibility. He had not expected a mirror. He had not expected his own veiled language to be turned back on him with such effortless, cutting grace. The mask of the calm, efficient waitress was more than just a disguise. It was a declaration of war. And as Ethan's cries crescendoed once more, pulling the room's attention back to the unfolding family drama, Alara knew her opening move had been made. The game had begun. Alara's apartment was a world away from the suffocating opulence of the Magnolia Room. It was a small, sterile space in a nondescript building on the industrial side of town, furnished with only what was necessary: a bed, a desk, a single chair. There were no photographs, no mementos, nothing to betray the ghost who lived there. The only color, the only sign of life, was on the wall above her desk. It was a sprawling corkboard, a chaotic mural of her obsession. At its center was a faded photograph of Julian Thorne, his smile radiating a chilling, empty charisma. Branching out from his image were lines of red yarn connecting him to a web of corporations, offshore accounts, and political allies. To the side, in a separate, hallowed space, was a picture of her father, David Vance. He was younger, his face alive with a brilliant, kind intelligence, his arms slung around a teenage Alara. She looked happy, blissfully unaware of the abyss that was about to open beneath her feet. 5 years ago, Vance Engineering had been their life. It was more than a business. It was her father's dream, built from the ground up on principles of integrity and innovation. He was an artist who worked in steel and concrete, a man who believed that a well-designed bridge was a form of poetry. Julian Thorne had been his partner, the money and the mouth to David's genius. Thorne brought in the contracts, schmoozed the investors, and promised the world. Her father had delivered it. Their final project was the Oak Haven Bridge, a marvel of modern engineering meant to connect the city's burgeoning tech sector with the mainland. Alara remembered the scent of sawdust and schematics in her father's study, the late nights he spent poring over stress calculations, his face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Then came the collapse. The memory was a raw, festering wound, the horrifying sound on the news, the images of twisted metal and submerged cars. 6 people had lost their lives. The media firestorm was immediate and brutal. Thorne, with his impeccable connections and silver tongue, had moved swiftly. He held a press conference, his face a mask of practiced grief, and laid the blame squarely on David Vance. A catastrophic failure of precision, he had called it, using her father's favorite word like a dagger. He produced falsified documents, doctored emails, and paid off a junior engineer to testify that David had cut corners on materials to save money. Her father was ruined. His name became a synonym for failure and death. The lawsuits bankrupted them, forcing them out of their home and into a cramped, miserable apartment that smelled of damp and despair. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her father until he could barely breathe. 3 months after the collapse, his car was found at the bottom of a ravine. The police ruled it an accident, a tragic case of a man, distracted by grief, driving off the road. Alara never believed it. Her father was the most precise man she knew. He would never have made that mistake. She spent the next 5 years in self-imposed exile, working menial jobs in different cities, saving every penny. She put herself through night school, earning degrees in finance and data analytics. She shed Alara Vance like a second skin, erasing her past, building a new identity from scratch. Lena Petrova was born from grief and forged in rage. Lena was brilliant, anonymous, and patient, and for the last 6 months, Lena had been working at the Magnolia Room, the chosen hunting ground of Julian Thorne, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows. A soft knock at her apartment door pulled her from the memories. She opened it to find Marcus Thorne, not a relative of the man she despised, but a cruel irony of names. Marcus was in his late 60s, with kind eyes clouded by a permanent sadness. He had been her father's accountant and oldest friend, the only person left who knew the truth of David Vance's integrity. He was her anchor, her co-conspirator, her only family. "You look tired," he said, stepping inside and placing a worn leather briefcase on her small table. "It was a long night," Alara replied, her voice losing the clipped precision of Lena and softening into something more familiar. "I saw the news," Marcus said grimly. "Whitmore's son had an episode. The gossip sites are already having a field day." He paused, studying her face. "You were there." It wasn't a question. He knew her plan. He knew she had taken the job at the Magnolia Room specifically because it was a nexus point for Thorne and his circle, which included Richard Whitmore. "Thorne was there, too," she said, her voice flat. "He said something to me. He almost remembered." Marcus's expression darkened. "That's dangerous. Alara, if he recognizes you before you're ready—" "He won't," she interrupted. "He saw a waitress. Nothing more. But I saw him. And he's just as arrogant and rotten as I remember." She walked over to the corkboard, her finger tracing a red line connecting Thorne to Whitmore. "Richard Whitmore is the key. Marcus, Thorne respects his power. If I can get close to Whitmore, I can get inside their world. I can find the proof we need that Thorne didn't just frame my father. He murdered him." Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a thin file. "I may have found something. A shell corporation Thorne used back then, registered in the Caymans. It went dormant right after the accident. But there was one final transaction, a large wire transfer to an untraceable account, 3 days before your father's car went off the road." Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was a thread, thin and frayed, but it was the first real piece of evidence she had found in 5 years. "Tonight," she said, her voice low and intense, "Richard Whitmore saw something in me. Not a waitress. Someone who could help his son." She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over the contact information on a business card she had palmed from Whitmore's table before he left. It was a simple, elegant card, embossed with the name Richard Whitmore. An invitation, an opportunity. "Tonight wasn't just about Thorne," she said, a cold, determined light in her eyes. "It was about him." She looked from the card in her hand to the photograph of her father on the wall. "And I think I know how to get his attention." The chaos in the Magnolia Room had reached its crescendo. Ethan's renewed screams were sharper now, fueled by the fresh wave of stares and whispers. The manager was signaling to a security guard, his face a grim mask of professional necessity. It was happening too fast. Richard was losing control. His son was spiraling, and the public humiliation was about to become a forced, physical removal. Alara moved. There was no time for subtlety. She walked directly to the table, ignoring the manager's frantic, warning glare. She knelt, bringing herself to Ethan's eye level, entering the storm with him. "Ethan," she said, her voice cutting through his cries, calm but firm. "My name is Lena. I need you to breathe with me." Richard looked at her, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading hope. "I've tried. Nothing works." "This will," she said with a certainty that surprised even herself. She held up her hand, palm facing the boy. "We're going to draw shapes with our breath. My father taught me this. He was an engineer. He said every problem has a structure." The mention of her father was a risk, a crack in her carefully constructed persona, but it was an instinct she couldn't ignore. This was his legacy, a piece of his gentle, brilliant mind, and she would use it to build a bridge to this terrified child. "Look at me, Ethan," she commanded softly. "Breathe in for 4. We're making a square. 1, 2, 3, 4. She traced the shape in the air. "Now hold it. That's the circle. Perfect and still. 1, 2. Ethan's cries hitched, his frantic gaze locking onto her hand. "Now, breathe out for 6. That's the long side of the triangle. Let it all out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. She repeated the pattern. In for the square. Hold for the circle. Out for the triangle. It was a strange, hypnotic mantra. The other diners watched, mystified. Richard held his breath, his entire body tense. Slowly, miraculously, Ethan's ragged gasps began to match her rhythm. His small chest rose and fell in time with her count. The screams subsided into whimpers, then into silence. His body, once rigid as a board, softened. He stared at her, his eyes still wide and fearful. But the panic was receding, replaced by a dawning, exhausted curiosity. The entire restaurant was silent, caught in the wake of the subsiding storm. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic breathing of a woman and a child. Richard sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands as a sob of pure relief escaped him. He looked at Alara, his eyes shining with unshed tears. How did you do that?" "It's just a pattern," she said, her voice gentle as she remained on the floor with Ethan. "Sometimes, when the world is chaos, all you need is a simple pattern to hold on to." She had done it. She had forged a connection. In a room full of people who saw a problem to be removed. She had been the only one to see a person to be reached. She rose slowly, her professional mask slipping back into place. But before she could retreat into the background, Richard stood up, his hand shooting out to stop her. "Wait," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know who you are, but what you just did, no one has ever been able to do that. Not the therapists, not the specialists, not me." He fumbled for his wallet, pulling out a business card. "Please, I don't know what you do, but whatever it is, I need you. For Ethan. Call me. Anything you want. Any price." Alara took the card, her fingers closing around the thick, expensive paper. It felt like a key. "I'm just a waitress. Mr. Whitmore." "No," he said, shaking his head, his gaze intense. You're not. As he led his now calm son out of the restaurant, Julian Thorne watched from the bar, a thoughtful, dangerous expression on his face. He had witnessed the entire exchange. The waitress who had verbally sparred with him had just performed a small miracle for his biggest rival. He watched Alara walk away, her composure absolute, and he felt a chill of unease. He still couldn't place her, but his instincts, honed over a lifetime of corporate warfare, were screaming that this woman was not who she seemed. She was a variable he hadn't accounted for, and Julian Thorne hated unaccounted-for variables. 2 days later, Alara walked into the towering glass and steel monolith of Whitmore Technologies. She wasn't there to be a nanny. She had called Richard Whitmore and, banking on his gratitude, made a bolder request. She presented her resume, the one belonging to Lena Petrova, highlighting her degree in data analytics and her fabricated experience at a boutique financial firm in Chicago. She told him she was looking for a new challenge, and that, while she was moved by his offer, her skills were in finding patterns in numbers, not in childcare. Intrigued and still deeply indebted, Richard had passed her resume to his chief operating officer. An interview was scheduled, then another. Alara sailed through them, her intelligence and unnerving calm leaving a deep impression. They offered her a position as a junior analyst in the Strategic Acquisitions Department, a role that would give her access to the financial heart of the company and, more importantly, to the data streams of its partners and competitors, including Thorne Consolidated. Her new life was a tightrope walk over a canyon. By day, she was Lena Petrova, the quiet, fiercely intelligent analyst who spoke only when she had something vital to contribute, which was often. Her insights were sharp, her projections uncannily accurate. She earned the respect of her colleagues and the attention of her superiors. By night, she was Alara Vance, piecing together the ghost data of her father's ruin, using the company's powerful servers to run deep web searches and cross-reference financial records Marcus passed to her. Her proximity to Richard Whitmore also granted her entry into the city's elite social scene. It was at a sterile, champagne-fueled cocktail party hosted by a venture capital firm that she came face-to-face with Thorne again. He cornered her by a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering city. "Miss Petrova," he said, his smile a tight, bloodless thing. "We meet again. Quite a leap from serving canapés to analyzing quarterly reports. Isn't it?" "A change of scenery," Alara replied coolly, taking a sip of mineral water. "Richard has taken quite a shine to you," Thorne continued, his eyes probing, searching for a weakness. "He's a man who lets his heart lead him, especially where his son is concerned. It can make him reckless." He gestured to a group of investors laughing nearby. "This is a world of sharks. Miss Petrova, one must be careful not to be mistaken for bait." It was a veiled threat, a warning to stay in her lane. He was trying to isolate her, to paint her as a naive outsider who had gotten in over her head. "I've always found," Alara said, turning to face him fully, "that the most dangerous sharks are the ones who have grown fat and slow in a small pond. They forget what it's like to hunt. They become complacent." She gave him a small, knowing smile. "It's the new, hungry ones you should watch out for. They have nothing to lose." Thorne's expression hardened. The politeness vanished, replaced by a flash of cold fury, before he could retort. One of the investors called him over. As he walked away, he glanced back at her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. The Cold War had escalated. He knew, now, that she was not bait. She was a rival player, and he had no idea what game she was playing. That night, Alara felt the first real sting of Thorne's power. A prestigious project she had been leading at Whitmore Tech was abruptly reassigned. Her direct supervisor, a man who had praised her work only days before, suddenly couldn't meet her eye. No explanation was given, but the message was clear. Thorne had made a call. He was testing his influence, reminding her that he could close doors she had just managed to open. But instead of retreating, Alara pushed back. She spent the next 48 hours in a caffeine-fueled trance, running a side analysis on a potential acquisition target Thorne Consolidated was also pursuing. She found a critical flaw in their valuation, a hidden liability buried in pages of arcane legal documents. She presented her findings directly to Richard Whitmore, bypassing the chain of command. He was stunned by her thoroughness and audacity. "My team missed this. Thorne's team missed this. How did you find it?" "I was looking for patterns," she said simply. "Most people stop looking when they find the one they expect." Whitmore Technologies pulled out of the deal. 2 weeks later, the target company's stock plummeted when the liability became public, saving Whitmore millions and making Thorne Consolidated look foolish. In the corridors of Whitmore Tech, they started calling her the ghost, the quiet analyst who saw things no one else did. She had survived Thorne's first attack and countered with a devastating blow. She had proven her value to Richard and solidified her position, but she had also painted a target on her back. The game was no longer subtle. Thorne now knew she was a threat. The only thing he didn't know was why. The months that followed were a grueling battle of attrition fought in boardrooms, at charity galas, and through encrypted data streams. Alara and Thorne were like two grandmasters playing a silent, deadly game of chess across the city's corporate landscape. He would subtly sabotage a project she was working on. She would anonymously leak information about a weakness in his portfolio to a financial journalist. He would use his social clout to have her uninvited from a key networking event. She, through her impeccable work for Whitmore, would end up in an even more exclusive meeting that he couldn't access. With Richard Whitmore's unwitting help, she gained deeper access. He trusted her implicitly now, often asking for her opinion on sensitive deals. "You have a clarity I've never seen, Lena," he once told her. "It's like you can see the future." The irony was a bitter pill. She wasn't seeing the future. She was avenging the past. Marcus was her lifeline, his patient, old-school investigative work complementing her high-tech assault. He spent his days in dusty courthouse archives and his nights talking to retired engineers and construction workers. Anyone who had been involved with the Oak Haven Bridge. He was searching for a human source. Someone who had seen something. Someone whose conscience might have weighed on them for 5 long years. The close calls became more frequent. One night, while remotely accessing Thorne Consolidated servers from her terminal at Whitmore Tech, a security protocol she hadn't anticipated was tripped. Alarms blared in a server room miles away. Alara had seconds to sever the connection, erase her digital footprints, and reboot her system before a trace could be initiated. She sat at her desk, heart pounding, as the office's ambient lights flickered back on. Her screen was blank, innocent, but she knew she had been careless. Thorne's digital defenses were stronger than she'd anticipated. He was hunting for her, too. Another time, at a fundraiser for the city orchestra, Thorne's wife, a woman with a brittle smile and haunted eyes, cornered her. "You look so familiar," she said. Her head tilted. "Did you grow up here in Atlanta? I feel like I know your face from somewhere." Alara's blood ran cold. "I'm from Chicago," she lied smoothly. "I only moved here a year ago." But Mrs. Thorne continued to stare, a frown creasing her brow. The past was a minefield, and she was walking through it blind. The real breakthrough came not from a server or an archive, but from a cardboard box in Marcus's basement. It was filled with her father's old effects, things Alara had been too grief-stricken to sort through after his death. Marcus, ever meticulous, had saved everything, buried at the bottom. Inside an old engineering textbook was a small, micro-cassette recorder. Her father had used it to dictate notes. "He was always talking into that thing," Marcus said, his voice wistful. "Said it helped him think." Alara took it back to her apartment. Most of the tapes were mundane structural calculations, reminders to order supplies, notes for meetings. But one tape was different. It was unlabeled. She pressed play, and the tinny sound of her father's voice filled the silent room. But he wasn't dictating. He was arguing. "It's not safe. Julian, the tensile strength of these support cables is 20% below spec. It's fraudulent, and it's dangerous." Then came Thorne's voice, slick and dismissive. "It's creative accounting. David, the inspectors have been paid. The project is already over budget. We make this change, or we lose our investors. It's as simple as that." "I won't sign off on it." Her father's voice was firm, resolute. "My name is on these blueprints, my reputation. I won't put lives at risk for your profit margins." A pause. Then Thorne's voice, colder than anything Alara had ever heard. "You're a brilliant artist, David, but you're a terrible businessman. You think your reputation matters? The only thing that matters is the signature on the checks, and my name is on those. Don't stand in my way. It's my name on the line. Not yours, I'll bury you." The tape clicked off. Alara sat in stunned silence. The recorder clutched in her hand. She had always believed Thorne had framed her father after the collapse. The truth was infinitely worse. He knew. He knew the bridge was a death trap before it was even completed. He had threatened her father. And when her father refused to yield, Thorne had set him up to take the fall. Her quest for justice had been a cold, calculated campaign, but listening to her father's voice, so full of integrity and fear, and Thorne's voice, dripping with casual evil, something inside her shifted. The cold, precise machinery of her revenge was suddenly flooded with the hot, molten rage of a daughter who had just heard her father's murderer confess. Marcus called an hour later, his own voice shaking with a similar mixture of horror and vindication. "Alara, I found him. A retired police detective. He worked your father's accident. He said it never sat right with him. It was closed too quickly, ruled accidental before the forensics were even complete. He thinks someone high up put pressure on the department to close the case." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "He also ran the license plate of a dark sedan seen near the ravine that night. It was registered to a shell company, the same one I found in the Cayman Islands, the one owned by Thorne Consolidated." The final piece clicked into place. Thorne hadn't just framed her father. He hadn't just ruined him. He had him killed. Alara looked at the corkboard, at the picture of the smiling, soulless man at its center. This was no longer about restoring a name or reclaiming a legacy. This was about vengeance, pure, simple, and absolute. The ghost was done hiding. It was time to start haunting. Thorne sensed the shift. He didn't know the cause, but he felt the change in the currents of their silent war. The attacks from the ghost became more aggressive, more personal. An anonymous tip to the SEC about insider trading on one of his recent acquisitions led to a formal investigation. A carefully placed story in a trade journal questioned the structural integrity of a new skyscraper being built by Thorne Consolidated, causing a dip in his stock price. They were pinpricks, but they were precise, and they were drawing blood. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Lena Petrova was behind it. He put his best security team on her, ordering them to dig into every aspect of her life. They came back with nothing. Her background was a fortress, her digital footprint clean. She was exactly who she said she was, a brilliant analyst from Chicago. The perfection of her cover was, to Thorne, the most damning evidence of all. No one was that clean. Cornered and increasingly paranoid, Thorne did what powerful, desperate men always do. He lashed out. And he chose the most vulnerable target he could find, Richard Whitmore and his son. The first blow was corporate. Thorne initiated a hostile takeover bid for a struggling but sentimentally valuable division of Whitmore Technologies, a legacy company Richard's father had founded. The move was financially irrational, but strategically brutal, forcing Richard to divert resources and attention to fight a war on a new front. The second blow was personal and unforgivable. A sleazy online gossip columnist published a story titled, "Billionaire's Unstable, Heir a Danger to Himself." The article was filled with anonymous quotes describing Ethan's violent outbursts and uncontrollable behavior, painting a picture of a child who was a menace. It hinted that Richard's ex-wife, who lived in Europe, was deeply concerned and might reconsider their custody agreement. The timing was no coincidence. Richard's ex-wife was a notoriously flighty woman, easily influenced by public opinion. The story was designed to terrorize Richard, to use his deepest love and greatest vulnerability as a weapon against him. Alara found Richard in his office late that night, staring out at the city lights, a broken man. The usual energy that surrounded him was gone, replaced by a heavy, defeated stillness. "He's using my son, Lena," he said, his voice raw. "He's using my beautiful, innocent boy to hurt me." A cold fury, sharper than any she had felt before, surged through Alara. Thorne had crossed a line. He had targeted a child, weaponizing his condition for leverage. In that moment, protecting the Whitmores became as crucial as destroying Thorne. Her meticulous plan for a slow, systematic dismantling of his empire was no longer enough. This had to end, and it had to end publicly. "He's doing this because he's losing," Alara said, her voice a blade of ice. "He's bleeding, and he's panicking. This isn't a show of strength. It's the last, desperate act of a coward." "But it's working," Richard whispered, his shoulders slumping. "My lawyers say this custody threat is real. My board is panicking about the takeover. I'm fighting on too many fronts." "Then we end it on one," Alara said, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made Richard straighten up. "We choose the battlefield. We choose the time. And we burn him to the ground." Her eyes fell on an invitation sitting on his desk. It was for the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, the city's premier philanthropic event. Scheduled in 2 weeks, this year's event was set to honor a recipient with the Foundation's Humanitarian of the Year award. The recipient, chosen months ago by a committee heavily influenced by his donations, was Julian Thorne. Alara looked from the invitation to Richard's anguished face. The perfect stage, the perfect audience, the perfect, poetic justice. "Don't cancel the gala," she said, her voice low and steady. "And don't rescind his award. Let him come. Let him walk up on that stage in front of the whole world, live-streamed for everyone to see. Let him have his moment of triumph." A grim, predatory smile touched her lips. "And then, we take everything." The night of the Whitmore Foundation Gala was a symphony of manufactured elegance. The ballroom was a cavern of glittering chandeliers and the scent of old money and new ambition. The city's elite drifted through the room, their laughter as brittle as the champagne flutes in their hands. The event was being live-streamed, a testament to its importance in the philanthropic world. Alara moved through the crowd not as a waitress, but as a guest. She wore a simple, elegant dark blue gown, her hair pulled back in a severe chignon. She was Lena Petrova, the rising star of Whitmore Technologies, Richard Whitmore's trusted advisor to anyone watching. She was the picture of poise and success. But beneath the silk dress, her nerves were stretched taut as piano wire. Marcus was her eyes and ears, stationed in a nearby hotel with a laptop, ready to assist. Every piece of evidence, the audio tape, the financial records, the detective's testimony, the shell company's car registration was loaded and encrypted, ready to be deployed. She saw Thorne holding court, his charisma a magnetic force, drawing people into his orbit. He looked invincible. When he saw her, he gave a slow, condescending nod, a king acknowledging a minor courtier. He had no idea he was a dead man walking. The climax of the evening arrived. Richard Whitmore, looking tired but resolute, walked to the podium to present the main award. Alara stood in the wings of the stage, near the audio-visual control booth, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "This year's Humanitarian of the Year," Richard began, his voice steady, "is a man whose name is synonymous with progress in our city, a man of vision and unparalleled drive, Mr. Julian Thorne." Polite, enthusiastic applause filled the room as Thorne made his way to the stage, shaking Richard's hand and accepting the heavy crystal award. He stepped up to the microphone, his smile beaming out at the crowd and the thousands watching online. "Thank you, Richard," he began, his voice smooth as velvet. "I am truly humbled. I've always believed that our true legacy isn't what we build with steel and glass, but what we build within our community, a foundation of trust." It was the signal. From her position, Alara gave a nod to the AV technician, a young man she had befriended over the past week. He hit a sequence of keys. The massive screens behind Thorne, which had been displaying the Foundation's logo, flickered and changed. They now showed a single, stark headline: "The Oak Haven Bridge, Collapse What Really Happened." A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Thorne faltered, his smile freezing on his face. He turned to look at the screen, his eyes widening in disbelief. Then, her father's voice, clear and strong, echoed from the ballroom speakers. "It's not safe, Julian. The tensile strength of these support cables is 20% below spec." Thorne's face went white. Gasps erupted from the crowd. His confident voice followed, cold and damning. "It's creative accounting. David, I'll bury you." The audio was just the beginning. The screens began to cycle through a cascade of irrefutable evidence. The forged safety reports with Thorne's signature, the offshore bank statements showing payments to the falsifying engineer, the labyrinthine chart of shell corporations used to hide the profits from the substandard materials. Every lie, every crime, laid bare in front of his peers, his investors, and the world. Thorne stood frozen at the podium, a statue of horror. The applause had been replaced by a rising tide of shocked whispers and frantic phone tapping. His empire was crumbling in real time, live on camera. Alara prepared for the final, killing blow the evidence linking him to her father's murder. The retired detective's sworn affidavit, the details of the police cover-up, and the car registration linking the sedan at the scene directly to Thorne's shell company. This was the checkmate. This was for her father. Just as she was about to signal the technician, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Alara, stop. Final piece. Don't use it. The payment to the detective to close the case." It wasn't from Thorne directly. It came from a blind trust, a trust established by Richard Whitmore's father. The world tilted on its axis. Ilara stared at the phone, the words blurring. Richard's father, a contemporary of Thorne and her dad, had helped cover up the murder investigation, not because he knew the details. Marcus's follow-up text clarified, but to prevent a scandal by association that would have damaged his own company's reputation. Richard didn't know. He was innocent, but his family's name was tied to the darkest part of the crime. She looked from her phone to the stage, where Richard stood watching Thorne's destruction, his face a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. She looked out at the audience and saw Ethan in a quiet corner with his nanny, watching the commotion with wide, confused eyes. She had a choice, a split-second moral decision that would define the rest of her life. She could deliver the final, devastating blow, exposing Thorne as a murderer, but in doing so, she would destroy Richard Whitmore, the one decent man who had helped her, and shatter his innocent son's life with the sins of his grandfather. Or she could stop, allowing Thorne to escape the murder charge, but ensuring his complete professional and social ruin. Was this about absolute vengeance, or was it about justice? Her father's voice echoed in her memory, not from the tape, but from her childhood. Precision. Ilara. It's not about using the most force. It's about using the right amount of force in exactly the right place. She took a deep breath. She gave the technician a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The final slide never appeared. The evidence of the murder remained her secret. She had presented enough to send Thorne to prison for fraud and corporate manslaughter for years, to utterly decimate his name and his company. It was enough. It had to be. As security guards, summoned by a shell-shocked Richard, began moving toward the stage, Thorne finally broke. His face contorted in a mask of pure rage, and his eyes found Ilara in the wings. For the first time, the flicker of recognition solidified into pure, unadulterated certainty. "You!" He breathed into the live microphone, his voice a ragged whisper that carried through the horrified ballroom. "Vance, it's you!" And in that moment, as the whole world watched, Ilara Vance let the mask of Lena Petrova fall away. She stepped out of the shadows and met his gaze, her expression not of triumph, but of profound, somber finality. She had not just exposed a criminal, she had reclaimed her name. In the chaotic aftermath, as news vans swarmed the hotel and Julian Thorne was escorted away in disgrace, Ilara found Richard in a quiet corridor. He looked at her, his face pale, the pieces finally clicking into place. "Lena, your name isn't Lena, is it?" he asked softly. "It's Ilara Vance," she replied. "David Vance was my father." Understanding, followed by a wave of shame, washed over Richard's face. He now saw the full picture, her calculated entry into his life, her relentless pursuit of Thorne. He had been a pawn in her game, albeit a willing one. Ilara held up her phone, showing him the text from Marcus. "I know about your father's involvement, the blind trust, the payment to the detective." Richard stared at the words, his body slumping against the wall. He had no knowledge of it. But the name, the connection, was undeniable. The sins of the father. "My God," he whispered. "I never knew. He and Thorne. They were friends, rivals. He always said the Vance scandal was a tragedy. But that business was business." "He chose to be silent," Ilara said, her voice devoid of accusation, simply stating a fact. He helped a murderer bury his crime to protect his own reputation. Tears welled in Richard's eyes. "What my family did. It's unforgivable. But what you did tonight? You could have destroyed me. Why didn't you? Because this was never about you, Alara said. And it was never about your son. My war was with Thorn. Using you, or hurting Ethan, would have made me no better than him. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. My father's name is cleared. Thorn will go to prison for what he did to the victims of that collapse. For me, that is justice. What you do with your family's truth is up to you. The next few weeks were a blur of headlines. Thorn's arrest, the collapse of his company, the reopening of the Oakhaven Bridge investigation, which quickly led to charges of fraud, conspiracy, and corporate manslaughter. The murder charge never materialized, the evidence remaining locked away with Alara. But Thorn's life was over. Richard Whitmore, true to his word, did not stay silent. He issued a public statement, confessing his father's role in the cover-up and pledging the full resources of the Whitmore Foundation to create a compensation fund for the families of the bridge collapse victims. It was a move that cost him dearly in social capital, but earned him something far more valuable: redemption. A month later, Alara stood in a small, quiet cemetery, the autumn leaves crunching under her feet. She placed a hand on the cool granite of her father's headstone. For 5 years, it had been a marker of shame. Today, it was a monument to a good man whose name had finally been restored. It's over, Dad, she whispered, the wind carrying her words away. They know your name again. They know the truth. A sense of peace, profound and unfamiliar, settled over her. The rage that had fueled her for so long had finally burned out, leaving not emptiness, but a quiet, clean space. 6 months later, Alara stood before a newly renovated building in the city's burgeoning tech district. The gleaming glass doors bore a simple, elegant name, the Vance Institute for Ethical Engineering. She had used the significant settlement she received as a victim in the class action lawsuit against Thorn's estate, combined with a large, anonymous donation from the Whitmore Foundation, to buy back her father's old company. She had reborn it not as a corporation driven by profit, but as a non-profit foundation dedicated to promoting safety, integrity, and accountability in the construction industry. It would fund scholarships, oversee independent safety audits, and advocate for families destroyed by the kind of corporate corruption that had taken her father's life. She wasn't destroying anymore. She was building. It was a legacy worthy of David Vance. As she stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the name etched in steel, a courier delivered a small, flat package. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a single, exquisitely folded paper crane. It was made from a piece of blue schematic paper. Tucked into its folds was a note, written in the careful, deliberate script of a child. It contained only 3 words. I am safe. Beneath the words was a small drawing of a square, a circle, and a triangle. Alara smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. The quiet boy who had started it all, who had been the unintended catalyst for her final, decisive move, had sent her a message. Her journey had begun with an act of compassion, born from a memory of her father. It had taken her through the darkest valleys of grief and rage, but it had led her here, to a place of peace and purpose. The cycle was complete. She had not only avenged her father, she had honored him, and in doing so, she had finally, truly, come home.